Good morning. This is the sermon that I'm practicing that I'll give in person on Sunday, June 27th, 2021. Healing, grief, and what's next? Our gospel reading is a story of two healings. More than just giving good sermons, Jesus got down to business and helped people directly by healing their ills. More than that, however, Jesus, God's Son, spends his time addressing the needs of the people he encounters. That's something we need to hear in our day and time. We find ourselves in an unusual time, a time where many things are coming out of the dark of the pandemic that has killed millions and changed us all, but also a time when grief is very present. It's a part of our daily lives and needs to be. The first reading from Lamentations for today gives us a way to touch the grief that's around us. It says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him." I'm going to hold that hope in one hand today while I touch the grief that comes from the last 15 months in the other. I, like you, have begun to do some things that we've been unable to do during the pandemic, like have conversations with people. I chatted with our veterinarian this past week. She knew I was a pastor and asked, "Have you lost a lot of people to the pandemic?" Wow. And so the trails of thought began in my head. Have I lost a lot of people? Well, yes. There was the longtime church member who was officially diagnosed with COVID and died within 48 hours of that diagnosis. There are the elderly church members who encountered so much isolation and loneliness during the pandemic that their aging process seemed to speed up and hasten their journey to death. There are the folks who in the isolation of pandemic spent so much time alone that imagining re-entry into social interactions is a fearful thing for them to imagine. There are the lost opportunities the pandemic brought. Careers stalled. Educational pursuits slowed or canceled. There is the feeling of disconnectedness we encounter, the stark and frightening plight of the houseless in our own neighborhoods. Somebody should do something, we think, but what and who? Grief is the real product of our time in pandemic, my friends, and grief is layered throughout the gospel for today. Can we take time to learn from Mark's writing? In the gospel, Jesus is back on the Jewish side of the lake, mobbed by crowds, and yet sought out by Jairus, a prosperous, connected man whose daughter is terribly ill. And so he seeks help from this dubious preacher and healer, and Jesus sets out to help. But another story overlaps with this. The woman who has been ill for years, and her illness is such that it would have meant she could not attend the temple, and no one else could touch her without also being put out of the temple. Her sadness, her isolation is real. She reaches out in faith to touch the garment of the healer, and her illness ends. But Jesus stops cold to call out to know who it was who touched him. And there, in the midst of people who avoided her for years, she admits it was she who in faith reached out for what she needed the most: connection, healing. And then Jesus focuses again on Jairus, but when they get to his home, his little girl has died from the illness. Jesus is not deterred and speaks to the deceased child. Little girl, come out. And in his quiet way, Jesus conquers death all in a moment, an outgrowth of his compassion for Jairus, his compassion for all the world. These stories all touch on grief, don't they? And loss. In this afternoon walkabout, Jesus is among his people, offering hope to people whose loss is real, whose grief is evident. Hope is his mission. What will we take from this, my friends? From God's Son who shows up, if sometimes a little late, to connect with our pain and loss. I'm reminded of Lamentations. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. But I also notice that the stories of these people in need are intertwined. They touch each other. They intersect. None of us lives in a bubble, and none of us are unaffected by the pain and struggle of another. We simply must find a way to connect to the pain and loss to the least of us as we struggle through these days as a pandemic seems to subside. We must think about those we have lost in the pandemic. We must ponder what each of us have lost in the pandemic and offer hope. Maybe it's giving an encouraging smile to the folks with signs that say, hungry, need help. Maybe it's joining hands with other churches and agencies like Family Promise, making a difference where they can. Maybe it's in having conversations again and saying, did you lose a lot in the pandemic? Our stories are connected, my friends. Speak hope to all those you encounter. Amen.